What does this graphic have to do with your story? Well, it's actually good news because it might offer you some freedom or breathing room in what otherwise might appear to be a restrictive model. I'll explain why in a bit. First, I want to cover the last few parts, the last pieces in the puzzle of the StoryJoules model. I'm Jule Kucera, creator and founder of StoryJoules, and I help writers craft powerful stories. For example, Ronnie Chavez said, "Your StoryJoules is a breakthrough in seeing arcs. Of course you are credentialed and a one-of-a-kind genius," which makes me feel kind of weird to say, but I'm trying to get better at tooting my own horn. Even though I love the StoryJoules model, don't let it put you through a forced march with your characters. It's important that you work from the foundations of the external dimension of order and chaos and the internal dimension of stasis and change. That will help you, as will knowing these pro tips, and I've got 3 of them. Just as with everything else, these pro tips are included in the StoryJoules handbook, which is linked down below. This is where we left off with the StoryJoules model. That little yellow triangle at the top in the 12 o'clock position, that represents the opening image and the closing image. Way back in episode 5, I said I wanted to wait to talk about those until I could talk about them together. So let's do that now. This is an opening image from Gladiator. What do you notice? Maybe the wheat, maybe the hand, maybe the ring on the finger, maybe the leather sleeve. Now think about the feeling. What kind of feelings are you getting from this? What kind of feeling about the world we might be entering? Something about this image for me sets a sense of longing, and I don't know why it is. Something about that hand touching the wheat. The opening image sets the tone that gets you prepared for the willing suspension of disbelief. And that's true of the opening image whether we're talking book or movie. It's the same thing. Here is a closing image from Gladiator. This one's different. What do you notice this time? What kind of feeling do you have this time? Even if you didn't know the story, if you just saw this, there's something sad or bittersweet about it. There's a hand touching wheat, but the hand isn't quite there. There's a sense of, I don't know, loss or mystery. This is why we read books and watch movies. We want to feel. We want to live vicariously through these stories, through these characters. For those of you who write novels or memoirs or short stories, I want to encourage you to think like a screenwriter, especially at the beginning and ending of your story. We tend to get caught up in words. We love words, and they're great, and we need them in our stories. And yet sometimes that can mean that we leave out important perspectives about setting, about what might be smelled or seen or tasted or felt, physically felt. So I have a question for you. What image sets the tone for your story? And if you don't think you have the right image, no problem. Don't try to just pick the perfect image right now. Instead, brainstorm a list of options, possibilities, and then noodle with those and see what might fit for you or what might work to draw the reader into your story. How can the closing image mirror the opening image? It works really well in Gladiator. You saw that mirroring of the image, and I really like it as a technique. You see it all the time in movies. In the novel that I'm working on, or was working on before StoryJoules took over my life, or I let it take over my life. The story starts with the avatar around a formal boardroom. Everybody's in suits. It's the 1980s. And then it ends with the avatar around a picnic table with her found family. So similar setting, they're around a long wooden table, but a very different feeling. That's an example of a mirror image, the opening and the closing. Previously, I've said that the theme of Gladiator is the difference that one person can make as they hold to their honor with all their strength. Because that theme is one person, it makes sense to have the opening and closing shots be of one person's hand. And I think the choice of the hand was really important because hand is how we act in the world. We act through our hands. And also hand represents touch, connection, tenderness. And both of those fit so well for this story. Now that we've covered the opening and closing images, the last piece of the StoryJoules model to put in place is theme, and that is at the very center of the model. Notice that the background is gray, and that's because that's how theme is. You don't declare the theme and here we are, here's the theme of this story. No, you let it hang out in the background and be discovered by the reader or the viewer. And yet, it's important that everything in your story connect to that theme. Let's see how this works with Gladiator. Here we have Maximus at the center, and these are the 7 Joules. And that's how we're going to check the theme connection. We're going to work from the Joules because those are supposed to be the 7 most powerful story moments. So let's check it out. The inciting incident of Gladiator comes in 2 parts. First, there's the internal, where Marcus Aurelius asks Maximus to stay, not to go home. And that's a brutal question because just moments earlier, after Maximus had won the war, the final war, they thought, Marcus Aurelius asks him, how can I honor Rome's greatest general? And Maximus told him, he said, let me go home. Notice the choice of words there, let me go home. Maximus, even though he's a general, he's not free to leave. He's in service to the emperor, let me go home. But the emperor asks him to stay. That's the internal inciting incident. The external one is when Commodus extends his hand to Maximus and says, take my hand, I offer it only once. And to take his hand is to swear allegiance. So there's that internal and the external, and both of them. The question is, do they test Maximus's commitment to strength and honor? Yes, they do. Next Joule, I gotta go. This is where, in response to Commodus, Maximus has to determine, is he responsible to honor the role of emperor and swear his allegiance to Commodus, or is he responsible to honor justice and not swear allegiance to Commodus? So does that connect to the theme of what can one person do, strength and honor? Yes, it does. Next Joule, whoa, shake up a belief. This is where Juba tells Maximus, we are worth less than lions. What can one person do if they're worth less than a lion? Does that connect to the theme? Yes, it does. And in case you're getting bored and you're saying, okay, Jule, you're just going to keep going and you're making your point, I don't want to stop because I can't tell you how many stories I've seen where one of or more of these Joules is not connected to the theme. And you can feel the disconnect as you read it. It just feels like I've gone off the road. And so that's why we're going to do that, to learn the point, but also to see how Gladiator does it, because Gladiator does it so very well. So let's go to that next Joule, the mindset-shattering midpoint. I'll go faster. Maximus learns great gladiators appear before the emperor. Does that relate to our theme of strength and honor? What can one man do? Yes, it does. Then we have the wham, all is lost. That is the downside of what can one person do. The downside is you can get your best friend killed. Yes, that relates. Then we have the Joule of the return changed. Does that relate? Yes, it does. And then lastly, the dig down deeper. And does this relate to what can one person do as they demonstrate strength and honor? Does this relate? Of course it does. And now, because I cannot end with that visual of Commodus's bloody face, I need to finish the emotional catharsis and remind us that Maximus falls, Lucilla runs to him, he dies, and then Maximus gets to go be with his family, the one thing he has wanted from the very beginning of the movie, the end. Now we have the complete model. 8 segments, 7 Joules, opening and closing images, and the theme. We just saw how Gladiator meets every one of those expectations. And I call them expectations because that's what we as hearers of a story, whether we're watching it, listening to it, reading it, our ancestors' stories have been passed down. They are encoded in our brains. And so we have expectations about what happens. And Gladiator meets those expectations. I know StoryJoules is a model for story structure. And yet, at its core, that's not how I see it. I see it as a model for how a person chooses to change or not change. Story structure models rest on that, not the other way around. It's those underlying foundations of stasis or change and the external forces, order and chaos, particularly chaos, that force that change. That was the first pro tip. Now we have 2 more. 1 is who owns the Joules, and 2 is why is the visual of the model misleading? Yes, it pains me to say it, but it's true. It's misleading, and you should know that. Here we have the 7 Joules, but the colors have changed. The ones with the gold background, those are owned by the antagonist. The ones with the white background are owned by the avatar. And I like to see this with faces because it makes it more visual. So here we have Maximus owning his Joules, the I gotta go, the mindset shattering midpoint, and the return changed. In all of those, Maximus is the primary actor. For I gotta go and return change, he's making decisions about leaving and coming back to the problem. For the mindset shattering midpoint, he's making a decision to, I'm going to change, I need to change. So those are Maximus owns those Joules. That's avatar Joules. The other four are owned by the antagonist, in this case Commodus. And it doesn't always have to be a person. It can be an antagonistic force, like it's the weather on the planet Mars in The Martian, or it's the voice in Eleanor Oliphant's head. But this is what exerts pressure on the avatar to change. The pressure comes from the antagonist, and the antagonist owns these four Joules: the whiff inciting incident, the whoa shake up a belief, the wham all is lost, and the dig down deeper. And those we just saw play out in Gladiator. Now we've got them all together, and that is pro tip number 2. My question for you is, do the avatar and antagonist own their Joules? In your work in progress, what you can do is you can go to those 7 key scenes and you can look at who's owning the action here, who's got the primary focus, who's taking the most decisive action, who's doing things that matter most. And that will tell you if you've got the avatar or the antagonist owning their Joules. Note that it doesn't have to be the antagonist showing up in the whiff inciting incident. It can be someone who represents them, who acts on their behalf. But in that dig down deeper, you got to go mano a mano. A head-to-head avatar versus antagonist. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, pro tip number 3. What does this graphic have to do with your story? Well, interestingly enough, if we took the 7 Joules as they're laid out in the model and we put them on this representation of the world, we placed them on a globe, it looks like this. And it appears that those Joules are evenly spaced, that they happen at regular intervals. If it's a movie, that they happen every 15 minutes in a 2-hour movie, or if it's an 80,000 word book, that they happen roughly every 10,000 words. But this is not always true, and it's not always necessary. These are the Joules, the timestamps from the movie Gladiator. And if you look at that, you go, not very balanced. But it's serving the story. And the reason it's serving the story is because in a movie that's heavily driven by action, we really like to pack that action into the last part of the movie. It feels so much more powerful when they come so fast, like boom, boom, boom. And you'll see this frequently in action movies. If you're wondering what's that big gap between like 5:30 or almost 6 o'clock and roughly 11 o'clock, that is all one segment, Plan A, Change You. And in that segment is when Maximus decides to become a great gladiator. It's when Lucilla comes up with her plan to overthrow Commodus, and it's when there are many, many subplots, the most significant of which is Lucilla, Lucius, and Commodus, and that whole dynamic, because that's one of the things that Maximus solves at the end of the movie. I hope knowing that gives you some breathing room as you write your story. Different stories need different pacing. If you're writing a story that has a lot of world building that you need to do, we probably need to spend more time in that first status quo segment because we need to understand how that world works. So that could be a fantasy, romantasy, sci-fi, historical. Anytime it's a world that we're not completely familiar with, we probably need more time in the status quo. In stories where the internal dynamic of change is predominant, you might have more time in the debate segment because there is such a debate that happens before that character is able to take action or willing to take action. So take heart. If you like to plan, use StoryJoules in your planning. If you like to be a more intuitive writer, write intuitively, and then use StoryJoules to evaluate your story and make revisions. If you'd like to get more StoryJoules help for your story, I'm doing a free webinar the day after this comes out. That webinar is tomorrow, Friday, September 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're not able to attend, there's a replay available for a limited time. Just click the link in the description to learn more. Next week, we'll learn about story dynamics that power your story. Thank you for being here. See you next time. Tally ho!